Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 79, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. After 2 weeks of not doing a podcast, I almost forgot what my intro was. I am back from my trip to Seattle. I went to spend Mother's Day weekend with my girls. My older one and her husband came down from Ketchikan, Alaska. They stayed with his parents, who also live in Washington State, and I went over to see them. And then I spent the rest of the time with my younger daughter, who lives in Seattle. She works at Nordstrom as an assistant buyer, and when I go to visit her, I always stay in the same Airbnb about a mile north of her apartment. It's really convenient. The Airbnb is darling. The owners are great. I think this is the fifth or sixth time I've stayed there. And the location is really convenient. It's a great home base when I'm in town. Of course, I did hit up all of the Joann Fabrics stores that were still open, and I bought mostly interfacing because by the time I got there, most of the garment fabric had been pretty picked over. The interfacing was 50% off, and I use Pellon Easy pattern when I trace my patterns, so I stocked up on several bolts of that, as well as some bolts of interfacing for making tops, and I think I'm all set for interfacing for at least a year or two, so that was good. I also hit up District Fabric. I went to Pacific Fabrics just south of downtown Seattle. I did quite a bit of damage there. I usually do because it's such a great store. And I'm hoping to have an interview with them sometime later in the summer. They've got a fascinating story, and they're also doing some really cool things. So it was nice to see the store kind of expanding its inventory and rearranging things. So I'm excited about having a couple of their staff members available for an interview later in the summer. I went to Issaquah Sewing and Vacuum, which started their closing sale on May 5th. I got there on May 7th, and probably 3/4 of their inventory, except for the machines, had already been sold. So they weren't messing around when they said they were going out of business. They discounted everything, and the only thing I ended up buying there was some Wonderfill Fabulux thread, which is a trilobal polyester, and I'm going to use that for quilting my Bernina University jacket. I got a spool of some gold variegated and came home and tested it out on some of my fabric, and I really love the way it looks, so I'm excited about getting that done. I can't wait too much longer to finish that project because the end of June will be here before I know it, but this is an incredibly busy time of year here, and I am just trying to keep my head above water. I needed to cut the grass, but it has been raining here almost constantly. I got a window where it dried out for 6 or 7 hours, and I was able to get most of the yard cut, but I still have to do the trimming. The big plant sale that I am the chairman of is coming up at the end of next week. I have a lot of responsibilities with the construction company that we own, so it's been a little bit nuts. And honestly, I haven't felt much like sewing. It is really hard to muster up the enthusiasm to sit down at the sewing machine and get anything done. So that's going to be the topic of today's podcast. What do you do when your sojo goes on walkabout? There can be lots of reasons why your sojo takes a vacation, and we're going to talk about all of those and some tips and tricks that you can use to get it back and get that enthusiasm about your sewing revved up again. I'm experiencing this a bit myself right now, and I thought it would make a timely podcast episode. I suspect sometimes that it's tempting to think of creativity as a faucet, and all we have to do is turn the knob and ideas come pouring out. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. I see creativity as more of a cycle. And sometimes you just have to kind of sit with the lack of motivation or the lack of creativity And that doesn't mean that you're being lazy. It means that you're allowing your creative process some time to rest and recharge, just like you would if you were physically tired. So whether you take a break voluntarily or it's thrust upon you by circumstances, I think it's important to accept it for the gift that it is and know that you will come out of it on the other side recharged and ready to go with lots of creative ideas. I know for me, I've established a pattern in my life where this time of year in the spring, my sojo almost always disappears. And part of that is because everything happens all at once. Suddenly it's warm and I need to be outside working and the garden needs to be planted and I have a plant sale to chair and we get baby piglets and we get chicks, and sewing just sort of gets shoved down the list of things that I would have time to do. It has happened every year for at least the last 6 or 7 years. I remember the year that I got my Q20, I bought it, I think in January, and I was really excited because I spent most of the spring working on quilts, and June rolled around and I literally didn't touch that machine again for 3 months. And the funny thing about sewing, at least for me, is that when I don't do it for a while, I get out of the habit of doing it. So the further I go, the more time that passes without doing any sewing, the harder it is to overcome that inertia and get started again. And that tends to feed itself into a kind of a vicious cycle. So I do try to sew, even if it's, in 1 week I may only have an hour to sew, and that may be broken up into little periods of 10 minutes apiece. But I'll take what I can get because at least I'm sitting down at my sewing machine and doing something. You can also get burned out after a big project. And I remember when I was a knitting designer, we used to talk about post-project letdown. So if I had just finished a really complicated Aran sweater design that maybe had taken me 6 weeks or so, I might just not want to look at an Aran sweater again for a couple of weeks. So I really do think that post-project letdown is an actual phenomenon, and we might experience it more than we think we do. Something that goes along with that is maybe creative paralysis, where you have 1,000 ideas and you can't sift down through them to pick out 1 or 2 that you want to concentrate on. It's almost like having too many choices leaves you with less of an ability to make a choice. Whereas if you only have 3 or 4 choices, you can narrow it down pretty quickly. And of course, social media can also cause us to doubt our abilities. I think maybe you've heard that phrase, comparison is the thief of joy. And when you are scrolling through Instagram or TikTok or blog or whatever, and you see all these beautiful, beautiful items that people are making, it can make you start to doubt your own abilities, and there goes your sojo. Losing your sojo sneaks up on you sometimes. It's not always really obvious. I know for me, one of the biggest indicators is I start buying fabric. And the reason I do that is because buying fabric is easy. Sewing it up isn't as easy. So if I don't have time to sew or I don't feel like sewing, a lot of what I will do is go to fabric stores and look at all the pretty fabric and come home with more fabric. And that's a two-edged sword. Sometimes finding a nice piece of fabric can ignite that creative spark, but the flip side of that is that if you come home with a lot more fabric, you can start to feel guilty about the fact that you have more fabric that you're not sewing up. So I try to watch. When I start to buy fabric rather than sewing it, then I know that maybe it's time to take a break. You might also start avoiding your sewing space, especially if it needs a good, thorough cleaning. Maybe you close the door to that room, or maybe you just don't walk by that particular part of the house where you have your sewing machine. Avoidance is a way to keep yourself from feeling pain, and maybe you're feeling pain about the fact that you aren't sewing for whatever reason that may be. Are you a list maker or a compulsive planner? Maybe you identify your lack of sojo by the fact that you just make endless lists of what you want to sew, or you plan what you want to sew. And planning is your way of maybe producing something without actually producing something. You've produced a list, surely that counts, right? Or maybe you notice that you've got piles of half-finished projects everywhere. And maybe you start to feel guilty about that, but you don't feel like working on any of them, but you feel guilty about starting something new. So again, you can create a vicious cycle there. Is any of this sounding familiar? I think we've all been through it in one way or another at some point in our life or another. Maybe it happens fairly frequently for you, or maybe it doesn't happen at all. Perhaps you're one of the lucky few that has an endless supply of creativity that you can manage, but I suspect that those people are few and far between. So now we come to the place where the rubber meets the road. How do you get your sojo back? I'll give you some ideas with the caveat that what works for someone else might not work for you. I've used all of these methods at one time or another, and I've used some of them simultaneously. It really just depends on the situation. But I think it's important not to let your sojo go on vacation for too long, because the longer you go without sewing, it seems to me the harder it is to get back into that daily routine or weekly routine or whatever your routine happens to be. So if you're trying to get back into sewing, and especially if you don't have large blocks of time, do something small. I keep a pile of little zipper pouches cut out and ready to go, and all they require is that I put a zipper in and sew them up, and I can knock out one of those in about an hour. Maybe you have time to cut out and sew a couple of napkins. Even if you only do 1 or 2 napkins a day, whether you're serging a rolled hem on them or you're making mitered corners on your sewing machine, seeing those finished objects piling up can be a really good motivator to keep going. Maybe handwork is the way for you to get motivated again. Cut out a new English paper piecing project or pick up some embroidery. Especially if you tend to be one of those people like me who measures productivity in terms of objects, doing some slow sewing can help you refocus and get back into the groove. I sometimes think that we don't play enough as adults. Kids have absolutely no trouble playing. Kids are not motivated by production. Most kids don't have any responsibilities, and if they're given a couple of hours of screen-free playtime, they can be very creative. So maybe you need a couple of hours of messing around with improv quilting. You've never done it before, you figure you don't have time to slot it into your sewing routine, but maybe what you need is to give yourself permission to monkey around a little bit. Perhaps you've been wanting to learn a new technique. One of my goals that I keep pushing off into the future, but one of my goals is to learn how to use the binding attachment on my cover stitch machine. And I really just need to sit down and goof around with it. If you're a person who has trouble being creative when your environment is too messy, then perhaps this is the time to do a thorough cleaning of your sewing area. Rearrange your furniture. Make it look new. Make it look fresh and uncluttered and inviting. I am not a minimalist. I will tell you that right now. My kids are already harping on the fact that they don't know what they're going to do when their father and I are gone because he and I have never met a tool that we don't like. And we tend to have a lot of stuff for our hobbies or our businesses. And I do try to be organized, but truly, I'm more creative in a messy space than I am in a completely clean and minimalist space. But there comes a time where if I can't find something and I have to spend an hour looking for it, then I realize that it's probably time to do a good decluttering and organizing. And sometimes I'll uncover things that I had forgotten about that will ignite that spark of creativity in me and make me want to get in there and finish them. If you're a person who works best in a clean, minimalist environment, then having things out and about might be what's stifling your creativity. If you're really ambitious, maybe you need to paint your sewing space or find a new sewing space altogether. I'll sometimes look around and try to think about where the bottlenecks are. So what about a project takes me longer than it should? Maybe I need to figure out how to streamline that process and eliminate that bottleneck. Part of the decluttering or cleaning and organizing process can include going through your stash. I love to shop my stash because I keep a running mental tally in my head of what I am pretty sure I have available, but I can't remember everything, so getting out my bins of fabric every so often and reorganizing them and looking at them is a surefire way to get me fired up about something. I like to do this in the spring and in the fall because in the spring I take out my wovens and I think about making woven tops or pants. In the winter, I get excited when I look at my sweater knits because I think about being cozy and warm and cuddly, and those are the kinds of things that I like to sew with in the winter. Look through your pattern collection. Maybe you'll pull out a tried and true pattern that you haven't used in a while. Maybe just revisiting something that's a quick win for you that you know will fit you well and look great, that can get you moving again. But maybe you're one of those people that looks through a pattern library and picks out something completely different and completely untried because the thought of that challenge of fitting a new pattern is what gets you excited. Something I do when I need quilt inspiration is I'll do a fabric pull. I might not know what kind of quilt I want to make, but just the process of pulling fabrics from my storage bins and putting things together and seeing what wants to play together, that often is enough to jumpstart me and I'll want to make a new quilt. You can set up a prompt for yourself or a challenge that can help get your sojo back. That might take the form of making a promise to yourself that you're going to sew for 20 minutes every day for a week and see if that gets you motivated again. You might make a pile of your works in progress and just tackle them one at a time. I do this periodically with my pile of mending. I did it yesterday. My husband had left a pair of pants that needed the crotch patched because that's where his pants tend to blow out from all the bending and crouching that he does every day in his job. So I will just make a pile of all my mending projects and I'll go through them one at a time. Maybe you've got a long-term sewing project going on. Maybe you've got a quilt that you've been working on that you can sew one block in half an hour. So set your work area up so that when you have that half an hour, you go and knock a block out. And before you know it, you'll probably have a quilt done. When I want to sew, but I have no idea what I want to sew, I have a quilt project that I've been working on where I use the Scrapper's Delight pattern from Sunday Morning Quilts by Amanda Jean Nyberg and Cheryl Arkeson. The Scrapper's Delight pattern is a log cabin type pattern, but it doesn't require any measuring. So I literally can just pull strips out of my scrap bags and sew mindlessly. And before I know it, I've got a block done. But now we're going to talk about the hard part, and that's changing your perspective. I am so guilty of this because I have such a deeply ingrained work ethic that if I am not doing something, I feel like I'm wasting time. I've had to work really hard to get out of that mindset and to understand that sometimes my brain needs to rest just as much as my body does. And that's okay. On my recent trip to Seattle, I was tempted to take a sewing machine with me. I've done that in the past. The Airbnb that I stay at has a great little spot where I can set up my machine. And when I get back at the end of a day, sometimes I will sit there and sew. But on this trip, I thought, I'm not going to take my sewing machine because I didn't want to force that kind of pressure on myself. It didn't feel like something I needed to do. So I went on this trip and I bought some fabric. I caught up on all of my podcast listening. I follow a couple of sewing podcasts and I don't always have time to listen to them right when they come out. So on the 8-hour drive over and the 8-hour drive back, I queued up all of the podcasts that I needed to catch up on. The other mindset shift that you might need to make is to let go of perfection. And this one, I kind of joke about it, but I tell people that when I make garments, as long as they look as good as what's coming out of China, I'm happy. I don't need to use couture techniques for my wardrobe because I'm the person that I have to please. So if I use some looper thread that doesn't exactly match the inside of my garment, hopefully nobody's going to be following me around and looking at the seams of my clothing to see that I used a thread that didn't quite match. And remember that done is better than perfect. Another one that I really struggle with, and you might resonate with this too if you're a content creator, is that not everything has to be social media worthy. It is okay to make things that you make for no reason other than to please yourself. You don't have to share everything with the world, so don't put that pressure on yourself. Sewing shouldn't be a chore. Sewing should not be, oh, I have to do this because my followers or my subscribers are counting on me to have content. I am here to tell you, having done this in some way, shape, or form since about 1998, that nothing will suck the joy out of your sewing more than having to do it out of obligation. On the other hand, looking at social media might be the jump start that you need. Maybe looking at Pinterest will give you ideas for finding your sojo again, or looking at what your favorite Instagram creator is doing. It isn't that social media is inherently good or bad. It's a tool, and how you use that tool determines its value to you. Learn to recognize and acknowledge the seasons in your life, and they could be literal seasons. My sewing tends to follow the actual seasons of the year. I get a lot more done in the fall and winter than I do in the spring and summer. But maybe for you, the seasons are defined by something more arbitrary or a different kind of metric. Perhaps you recognize that after every big sewing project or after every quilt that you've finished, you need a week or two off to do something completely unrelated to sewing. And learning to recognize and acknowledge how that creativity cycles in your own life can go a long way to removing the guilt, which is one thing that I have trouble with, and feeling less pressure to always be producing. These are my thoughts. If you have some suggestions or ideas for getting your sojo back, things that have worked for you, by all means share them. If it helps you, it might help somebody else out there. I appreciate the feedback that I've been getting. I love the show suggestions. I am making lists of all of them and trying to get some of those ideas put in place. I've got several interviews coming up in the next couple of weeks. People that some of my listeners have suggested as guests. So keep those ideas coming because I want to talk about things that you are interested in. I do want to keep this time focused on sewing as much as I can, even if I'm not actually doing it myself. You can send feedback to me using the fan mail feature. You can send me email at janet@janetzabo.com. You can comment on the show notes page. The show notes can be found on the podcast website, which is at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. My website is at www.janetzabo.com, and that has links to my blog and to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website, where you can purchase copies of my patterns and the 3 books that I've written. I would love to do a listener question episode sometime in the next couple of weeks, so if you've got burning questions that you would like an answer to, and that can be anything about sewing or about me or my opinions on whatever having to do with sewing, bring them on. I will compile an episode full of listener questions and try to answer all of them. Right now, I need to go out and mow the grass before it rains again, but later this afternoon, I'm hoping to do a little bit of sewing. So until the next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.